All right, today we're diving into a really thought-provoking and deeply personal article. It challenges us to look in the mirror and ask a tough question about our own faith. What if the very beliefs we cherish the most are actually getting in the way?
And the author just cuts right to the chase with this one central question. What happens when our beliefs, the frameworks we build to make sense of everything, actually become barriers? Not just walls between us and other people, but maybe even barriers to our own faith journey.
And here's what's so powerful about this whole piece. The author isn't just pointing fingers. They put themselves right at the center of it all. They say, one of the greatest and most damaging behaviors I have witnessed and been guilty of myself is worshiping doctrine. See, that's not an accusation, it's a confession. And that vulnerability really sets the stage for everything that follows.
Okay, so let's break this down. What does the author actually mean by worshiping doctrine? In this first part, we're going to dig into how they define this core problem.
So here's the definition the author lays out for us. Worship of doctrine is when we take our personal understanding of the scriptures and, well, we elevate it to a godly level. It's when our identity gets all tangled up in our specific interpretation, instead of, as the author puts it, being rooted in Christ alone.
Now, let's be super clear here. The author isn't saying doctrine is bad, not at all. The real issue isn't about having beliefs, it's about what we do with them. The problem kicks in when our personal take becomes a weapon for division, creating these us versus them camps, and basically turning our interpretation into its own little god. So, if this is the problem, what are the consequences? What's the fallout from all this? Well, the author makes a comparison here that is, well, it's pretty sharp. Let's get into it. And this is really the heart of the whole argument. The author says that when we put our own understanding on a pedestal, what we're really doing is creating a God in our own image. A God that just so happens to agree with all our biases, that makes our worldview feel safe and comfortable, and that fits perfectly inside our little box of logic. It's a really subtle but pretty profound form of idolatry when you think about it. What I find really fascinating is this distinction the author makes, which you can see laid out right here. On one side, you've got doctrine that puffs up, the endless intellectual debates about mysteries we can't possibly solve. And on the other side, you've got doctrine that transforms, the stuff that's all about action, humility, charity, and actually loving our neighbors.
And that idea of transformative doctrine leads us right here to what the author calls the forgotten commandments. The argument is that while we're all so busy with those debates that puff us up, we're often totally neglecting the very teachings that are supposed to be the absolute core of the faith.
So, what are we talking about here? What's this doctrine that really matters? Well, according to the author, it's not theoretical, it's active. It's stuff like loving your neighbor, being a doer of the word and not just someone who listens to it, and actually taking steps to provide for one another. It's a faith defined by what you do. And to really drive this point home, the author brings up a specific passage, Matthew 25, where Jesus talks about feeding the hungry and clothing the naked. The author's big takeaway here is that this makes having a charitable heart a salvational issue, yet they claim you almost never hear it talked about in sermons. So that begs the question, right? Why? Why would these core teachings get pushed aside? The author's take on this is pretty insightful, and maybe a little uncomfortable. We prefer debating mysteries because, let's be honest, it makes us feel smart and right. We tend to avoid the doctrine of charity because it shines a light on our own shortcomings and, well, it actually demands something from us.
All right, so we've seen the problem, we've seen the damage it can do. So what's the solution? How do we find our way back? That's what this final section is all about, returning to what the author calls the way. And to find that path forward, the author takes a huge step back and asks maybe the biggest question there is. What is life all about? The suggestion here is that if we're lost in all these doctrinal squabbles, we might be missing the whole point of the journey. And the answer they propose really comes down to two big shifts. First, a change in identity. Stop defining yourself by your denomination or your doctrinal checklist, and instead find your identity in Christ. And second, a change in focus. Seek out the practical, active faith, the way, instead of just trying to prove that your group is the most correct one. And really, this entire personal reflection boils down to this one last question for all of us to think about. Is your doctrine a roadmap, something that guides you on a journey of transformation? Or has it become the destination itself, a place where you just stop, build up walls, and proudly declare that you've already arrived?